Does this plant remind you of anyone? Well, if by some luck you guessed Nelson Mandela, you're absolutely correct, because this orchid's actual scientific name is Celera Nelson Mandela. Yes, it's named after him. Welcome to Singapore's Orchid Diplomacy.
Orchid diplomacy is using orchids to symbolize the deep bilateral ties that we share with other countries. The orchid naming ceremony is where an orchid hybrid is named after the visiting dignitary. We're talking heads of state, heads of government and royalty when they make their state official visits to Singapore.
And that's why we have the Peplionanda Xi Jinping Peng Liyuan, then Drobin Joe and Jill Biden, then Drobin Margaret Thatcher, and even Vanda William Catherine.
Over 280 orchid hybrids have been named after foreign dignitaries, international organizations and events.
But why name plants after people? And why orchids? The story of Singapore's VIP plants goes back to the 1850s, when the Singapore Botanic Gardens was founded.
The practice of naming orchid hybrids after dignitaries started as a colonial practice, something that Singapore inherited from the British, but the country then refreshed and reinvented. By the 1870s, the then superintendent was very interested in orchid hybridization. It was already a practice, but it was unusual in terms of Agnes Joachim, who was an immigrant in Singapore and a very avid horticulturist.
Agnes Joachim was the breeder of what would become one of our most famous orchid hybrids, the Vanda Miss Joachim. In 1893, the first scientific director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens, Henry Nicholas Ridley, recorded this in the Gardener's Chronicle.
A few years ago, Miss Agnes Joachim, a lady residing in Singapore, well known for her success as a horticulturist, succeeded in crossing Vanda Hookeriana and V. teres, two plants cultivated in almost every garden in Singapore.
The Vanda Miss Joachim won a prize in a horticultural show in London in 1897. And after that, the orchids from Singapore became popular worldwide. They were acquired and planted in gardens all over the world, including as far away as Hawaii. So that's the very long history of Singapore's association with orchids.
In 1956, the first VIP orchid hybrid, the Aranthera Anne Black, was named after Lady Anne Black, the wife of the former governor of Singapore, Sir Robert Black. And thus, the practice of VIP orchids was born.
For the last 15 years, I've been working on projects that help countries build their country brands. The orchid, as it's presented in terms of this cultural diplomacy, it represents what Singapore stands for, the multiculturalism, the openness. The orchid has something like 28,000 species. The parent plants come from all over the world. They are the kind of perfect symbol for the fact that we have this remarkable cultural diversity and cohesion. There is a shelf life that goes beyond just the presentation of the orchid. For example, when the Prime Minister of Japan visited Singapore in 2022, there was a VIP orchid named after him, and he took it back with him to Japan. In January 2023, the orchid bloomed and it was put on public display. The orchid would then continue to bloom over the years, so it has a very lasting impact. Each VIP orchid is unique. It's named after the dignitary, and it's not produced ever again except for special exhibitions. It's not available commercially. No one else can ever have it. So it's really special.
And the creation of these special orchid hybrids is the job of guys like Mark.
My name is Mark and I'm the Assistant Curator at the National Orchid Garden. So I've been breeding orchids for about 8 years, and what I find exciting about my role is being able to conceptualize new orchid hybrids. Some of the considerations that we have are how extravagant we want to be, the length of the flowers, the quality of the flowers in terms of the vibrancy of the colours, making them larger and making them more durable and more robust. And sometimes you want to introduce different traits onto different plants, such as fragrance. The hybridization process can be summarized in a few steps. Firstly, looking at what's flowering at that point in time, deciding on what I want to create, and then physically taking the pollen from one plant and putting it onto the stigmatic surface on another plant. And then, if it's successful, a seed pod will develop, and eventually we send it to the lab to germinate artificially. After they have germinated, we'll bring them back to the garden, and then we will grow them out and wait for the opportune moment for the flowers to be named after visiting dignitaries. It typically takes 3 to 5 years from hybridization till the plant can be used for orchid naming. The process is challenging, firstly because there is failure at every junction. So sometimes the seed pod doesn't even set. Secondly, if it's too wet, the seed pod can rot. If it's too sunny, the seed pod can get sunburned. Sometimes there's no viable seeds inside. Sometimes there's contamination. Sometimes the resulting plant just doesn't make the cut. So there's a lot of obstacles that we need to cross to get a very desirable hybrid.
So, to maintain a steady supply of orchid hybrids to be named after VIPs, the Singapore Botanic Gardens keeps a large collection of unnamed successful hybrids in storage. This ensures orchids are consistently available for our next VIP guest.
There are 50 different types of unnamed orchid hybrids that are ready to be named at any point in time. So when a request comes in, we will look through our nurseries, see what's flowering now, and then we'll compare which is the most suitable. We also sometimes get requests for certain colours. We also get requests for certain colours to avoid. We also think of other considerations such as the colours of the national flag of the visiting countries.
When we named the orchid after the former president of Chile, the scarlet hues on the orchid represent the red colour on both of our flags for Chile and Singapore. We also look into the lineage of the orchid hybrid, for example, whether its parent species originated from the country of the visiting dignitary. One example would be the Dendrobium Golden Friendship, which was named to mark 50 years of diplomatic relations between Singapore and Australia. That was created by crossing an Australian species and a Singapore hybrid.
And some have special meaning, like for example, the purple orchid is named after Joe and Jill Biden, former president of the USA. The purple signifies bipartisanship, red and blue becomes purple. Jill Biden wrote something in the internal White House archives, and she did refer to the orchid, that she would look after it and that she really appreciated it.
During the orchid naming ceremony, of course, the foreign leader sees the orchid for the first time, but apart from that, they also receive a birth certificate that explains the name of the orchid, how the hybrid came about, and its lineage. So not just admiring the beauty of the orchid itself, they also get to understand how the orchid hybrid came about and how it's unique to them.
On occasion, orchid namings happen overseas. I was part of the team that brought the orchid to the US to have it named over there. Typically, because it's a VIP orchid, we will not put these plants in cargo where handling is not so careful. So because this plant was so big, it couldn't fit on the overhead storage, we had to buy a seat for the orchid.
So did you sit in first class?
Oh no, yeah, she said economy.
So how does someone go about getting an orchid named after them? Apparently, you'd have to be either royalty or a dignitary, a celebrity or a Singaporean who has brought honour to the country.
In terms of local celebrities, we have named after Stephanie Sun in the past. Orchids named after Joseph Schooling and Ip Pin Siu, who won a gold at the World Paralympics.
When we hosted the state visit by His Holiness Pope Francis last year, it was a very big event, and it was also the first time that the proceedings were live streamed across the world. But to be there and to witness Pope Francis receiving the orchid that was named after him, I mean, his face just lit up. And that memory stayed with me for a long time.
Apparently, you could also have a VIP orchid with your name if someone important names it after you.
I have been given the honor of naming a unique orchid, and I nominated the name of my mother to give respect to her. The Singapore Orchid Diplomacy. Maybe we should copy this also. I hope there is no hak patent, copyright. Is there a copyright?
To date, the National Orchid Garden has the largest and most comprehensive tropical orchid display in Asia, with over 1,500 orchid species and 2,000 orchid hybrids on display. Each VIP orchid hybrid is unique in the world, and they can likely only be viewed by the public in one place on Earth, the VIP Orchid Garden.
Actually, many visitors and tourists come by and they're actually looking for orchid hybrids that have been named after their Prime Minister or their President. And to see how these tourists react, to see that, oh, we have this orchid named after their Prime Minister, actually, it also brings them a lot of joy. And when they are happy, we are also very happy.
To see the successful completion of the orchid naming ceremony is very satisfying. And when we see that the orchids are flown back with them and continue to sustain that close bilateral relationship through Singapore's soft power, I think it further adds meaning to the work we do in MFA.
The VIP orchids are central to Singapore's cultural diplomacy. It's kind of like an album of some of Singapore's best friends and allies.